Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the Belfast Telegraph columnist Allison Morris. So let's see what's on the front page of some of those pages for you now. Well, the Eye reports that while hospital admissions amongst patients with COVID have risen by 38% in the last week, instances of serious illness amongst those with the Omicron variant remain lower. The Mirror is also confident with the headline, New Year, New Hope. It says there's a growing belief that Omicron will not swamp the NHS despite a surge in cases. The Telegraph hears that some NHS text messages are telling people to isolate for an incorrect number of days after government guidance changed last week. The Mail leads with experts' calls for self-isolation periods in England to be cut further to just 5 days. That's also the top story for The Times. Scotland's The National carries criticism of the Conservative MP, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, for referring to the devolved nations as principalities whilst discussing COVID restrictions. The Guardian focuses on warnings that 2022 will be the year of the squeeze as the cost of living soars. And according to the Financial Times, 2021 was a blockbuster year for companies across the world. Despite the pandemic, they collectively generated funds of more than $12 trillion. Joining me tonight, Steve Richards and Allison Morris to take us through the newspapers. Welcome to you both. Let's start by having a look at The Eye and their headline there saying that more people in hospital with Omicron, but this variant less severe than perhaps previously thought. Is this all as it seems? Is this completely good news, Alison?
Well, they're saying the number of hospital cases has increased by 38%. And obviously that's quite alarming because that's quite a huge increase. At the same time, too, remember a lot of people who have fallen to Omicron are also those healthcare workers, the nurses, the cleaners, the porters, the doctors, and therefore the health service is already under strain because of that. But it does seem to be less serious. And I think I probably know more people who have caught COVID in the last month than I have known since last March, but none of them appear to have been very seriously ill. Most have described it like a head cold. And we have to hope that that is how this virus has mutated, because it doesn't seem that there's any other way out other than if the vaccines are proven to be effective against it and the virus itself is mutating to a weaker form. You have to hope. So they're saying why the hospital numbers have increased, the number of people on ventilators, the number of seriously ill people who are likely to lose their lives is not increasing. And that's really important because it takes so many hospital staff to care for someone who is in intensive care. That is the sort of labour intensive aspect of looking after patients with COVID, and that is what puts the most stress on the health service. So we can only hope. I think that there's a delay in the number between cases and the time of serious hospitalisation. So I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet. Maybe the middle of January we'll know for sure. But, I've always tried to remain optimistic in terms of this. You have to look at the sort of glass half full side of it. And if scientists and experts and people who know much better than me are saying that this variant may be weaker and this may be our way out, well, then you've only, I'm going to take what they've said and hope that that's accurate.
But though the symptoms might be milder, Steve, there are still consequences because people are still having to isolate. So still consequences on how we live our lives and also on the economy.
Yeah, and as that headline indicated, a lot of people are still going into hospital, though without the same severe symptoms as with previous variants. So that kind of raises some very interesting issues. This COVID saga, at each junction, there are new questions arising. And it seems to me one of them now is that the evidence suggests a lot of the people who need hospital care with this apparently milder variant haven't had the vaccine. So how do we learn to live with COVID, to use that cliche, when there is this reluctance to get the vaccine on quite a significant proportion of the population? It seems to me that's the key question that arises from this one. Like Alison, virtually everyone I know has got this variant, but the only one who hasn't got it of the people I know. But it does seem to be, if you've had the triple vaccination, much less severe. But if you haven't, some people are going into hospital, and that's on top of people who've got the Delta, on top of people who get flu at this time of year. So there is still an increased pressure on an NHS already creaking for all kinds of different reasons, not least 2 years of this. And we've got to work out a way of getting more people vaccinated.
Meanwhile, the Mirror saying that the virus fight still rages on, but quite an optimistic headline, New Year, New Hope. And they're quoting Professor John Bell, who's saying that jabs have helped and added to the fight against Omicron. And he's saying that the horrific scenes we saw a year ago are history, in his opinion. Alison.
Yeah, and we have to hope that that's because of the vaccine, and that's why we're in a different situation this Christmas than we were last Christmas. I mean, I had COVID earlier on in the year in October, and I had a very mild dose of it, and I assume that the vaccine helped with that. I was actually able to work from home, albeit the whole way through it, and it was fine. I know people who had more serious illnesses, and I think that that's really those people who were frontline workers, people like nurses and teachers who were subjected to massive viral loads of the virus. And we have to look at how they can be better protected going forward. But I mean, Sir John Bell, is a professor. He's someone who knows exactly what he's talking about. He's looked at the data and he's saying that this may be finally the path out of this. I don't think that any of us thought when this started last March that we'd still be sitting here talking about it. But the problem is with the fact that we have had, successive governments who have depleted the NHS. And so it was never ready for a pandemic of this scale. In Northern Ireland, our health service was practically on its knees before COVID with atrocious waiting lists, the worst in the UK. So imagine how much worse that has been made by COVID and by the fact that we have so many nurses and doctors and hospital staff now isolating. And all of those things should have been dealt with in terms of future-proofing the NHS, making sure it was properly funded and making sure that the staff there were properly paid and felt valued. Because we've also seen hundreds of NHS nurses, specialists, ICU nurses leaving for other jobs because they just felt underpaid and at that point they weren't being properly treated as the way they should have been, because these are the people that we're relying on to save our lives when something such as this happens.
And Steve, despite the optimistic tone of the Mirror and the suggestion that the worst of the pandemic may be over, there's still a warning that those going out to celebrate New Year's should be cautious.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily saying the worst of the pandemic. They're referring to this particular variant and the optimism that it's nowhere near as severe as some of the others. But clearly there needs to be caution. I mean, everyone is catching this thing, meeting over a cup of coffee. So you can imagine what it's going to be like on New Year's Eve in nightclubs and pubs and all the rest of it, in England at least, where, the sort of libertarian streak of this government has prevailed. And, as I say, although it is less severe, the hospitalisation numbers, on top of all the other pressures, could become considerable. And it will be those who haven't had the vaccines. So, it's great that it's nowhere near as severe, it seems, as some of the others, but still with big implications for the demands on the NHS.
Alison, to the Daily Telegraph and Test and Trace seemingly giving misinformation to people regards to the isolation period.
Yeah, well, the isolation period is supposed to now be 7 days if you test negative, which is the important part of that. The Telegraph is reporting that it's still telling people to isolate for 10 days, which obviously is putting a strain on those frontline services. And just tonight, before I came on here in my day job, I was reporting about how the Police Service of Northern Ireland were operating with 20% less officers over the Christmas period because so many of them were isolating. And that seems to be replicated across the UK and also in the south of Ireland, where they're also struggling in terms of those numbers. So getting that down to the 7 days if people test negative is very important. But also, I do think it's important to remember that it has to be done in a safe way. There is also a push to try and go for the 5 days, which the US government have now introduced. And we have to make sure that those 5 days aren't just about keeping business going rather than keeping people safe, and that it makes sure that there is enough tests available that people test negative before they're forced to go back to work again.
This is a serious issue, though, isn't it? Because it's causing unnecessary confusion, Steve.
Yeah, although do you think many are that confused? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the
well, if they're getting messages saying that it should be 10 days, even though they might have seen elsewhere that it's 7.
I'm allowed to use the word phrase cock-up, and there have been lots of cock-ups en route, and clearly it will be a minor temporary issue. But it is clear, I mean, there's a bigger debate about whether the new time should be revised to be less than it currently is. But I think that won't be a big issue for very long.
Let's take a look at The Guardian now, and this is sobering for all consumers. It's going to get tighter than it's already been. The cost of living set to absolutely soar. We know some of this precipitated by the energy rises that are looking likely to come in, 50% or more increase. It's not looking great for 2022 with this prospect, is it, Alison?
You know, it's horrendous when you think about what a £1,200 a year increase in the cost of living does to some families who are already living on the breadline, who are barely making ends meet. You know, we've seen a massive increase in the use of food banks. And I think that the link between, you know, what's happening in terms of the increase in fuel prices, but also in terms of the fact that wages, and especially public sector wages, haven't increased along with that, means in real terms, a lot of people have had almost pay decreases. When you look at the cost of inflation in terms of how prices have been rising, and it just puts some people in such a dire situation where they're having to choose whether they eat or whether they heat their homes. And it's as simple as that. You know, some of us are very lucky and we're in very privileged positions, but I always say, well, I'm a woman of privilege now. I wasn't always. I was once a teenage mother. I was once living on benefits. I was once living in a situation where my budget was worked out down to the last 50 pence every week. And if you'd have put a massive increase like that in terms of the price of gas and the price of food, I just wouldn't have been able to budget my money. And it's as simple as that. And there are people living like that every day. And these are people who are working hard, who are doing, you know, really difficult jobs, really difficult, hard frontline jobs in many cases, and they're just not being paid enough to keep their families. I think that there needs to be an urgent intervention by government to tackle this, to ensure that employers are paying a living wage and not just a minimum wage, and to give people who are on people who are on the breadline, people who are the working poor, people who are stuck on benefits or sickness benefits, extra help with heating, especially during the next few months in those winter months, because otherwise I'm not sure that many families will be able to cope. And we know that we're talking about hospitals and the pressure on hospitals. Well, poverty and health are completely linked. If you don't deal with one, then you see an increase in admissions to the other one. You know, the two things work hand in hand.
The Resolution Foundation, the think tank, which is giving some of these stats, is describing it as a cost of living catastrophe. I mean, this is going to push very many families over the edge, isn't it, Steve?
The Resolution Foundation do well with generating news stories out of its very kind of forensic analysis of what's going on. It's on the front pages of quite a few of tomorrow's papers, not just The Guardian. The interesting thing about this is, I mean, it basically highlights two elements: a big tax rise coming up at the start of the next financial year in April, and as Alison was discussing, the big increase in gas prices looming. Neither are inevitable. The tax rise, there was absolutely an incredibly powerful case to raise taxes to pay for the demands on the NHS and social care. It didn't have to be done with the rise in national insurance, which is the way it's going to happen, and that will affect a lot of people. And the gas market in Britain is so wacky. All these companies betting, in effect gambling on the price of gas, and then incapable of coping when the sort of calculations have gone all wrong with soaring costs of the gas, which they themselves don't provide. And so that's just two examples. I think inflation will be fueled partly by those rises, but through other things, like there's going to be much tighter Brexit controls on trade starting in January, and that will have an impact as well. So it's going to be a really challenging time. And what's interesting is whether this does have an impact on the government standing, which is already behind in the polls at the moment through all the other issues.
Indeed. Steve and Alison, we must leave it there.